Welcome to Just Coast, Explore Moody Gardens podcast. I'm Miranda Lee, and welcome to our very first episode. As a public nonprofit educational destination on beautiful Galveston Island, this podcast is dedicated to our mission, utilizing nature in the advancement of rehabilitation, conservation, recreation, and research. We're kicking things off with a very special guest, Emmy Award-winning conservationist Jeff Corwin.
Hi, I'm Greg Whitaker, the Animal Husbandry Manager here at Moody Gardens, and we're on the paddle wheel boat, which is one of our mainstay attractions here in Galveston. And I'm here today with Emmy Award-winning conservationist Jeff Corwin. Jeff, welcome to Moody Gardens. We're really proud to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Well, first off, I'd like to get a little bit of your personal background, how you got inspired with nature and conservation.
Well, I always was a nature kid. Ever since I remember growing up, we lived in a somewhat urban environment early on in my life. My dad is a retired Boston police officer, and my mom is a retired registered nurse. And we used to live in what we call a triple decker, just not the most beautiful neighborhood, not a lot of wildlife. So the only time I ever saw wildlife is when I got to visit relatives. And one day in my grandparents' backyard, I discovered a garter snake. And that was kind of my gateway journey into nature. And that experience really germinated my passion for exploration, for critters, for the outside. And when I was about 6 years old when that happened. And I observed, if you know anything about reptiles, they're the ultimate creature of habit. And after 2 years, I learned so much from this snake. I named her Gladys. When I was about 8 years old, the next door neighbor to my grandparents decapitated that snake in front of me with a spade. And that just totally switched another light on for me. So the discovery of that garter snake was the day I became a naturalist. The day I became a conservationist is when I realized good people make bad decisions when they lack information.
Excellent. And I was going to follow up with what switched you over to the conservation side, but that was a very telling story, and it's nice that it was all one piece. This profession is obviously more than just a job for you. Is there any stories along those lines that you can tell about how this is not just a job?
Well, I knew when I was from a little kid that I would work in the natural world. I didn't know if I was going to be a zookeeper. I didn't know if I was going to be a field biologist, a high school teacher. I did not know how that would manifest itself, but I knew I would always be doing something like that. And when I was about 16 years old, I had a chance to explore a tropical rainforest with a scientist who was studying reptiles and amphibians, invited me along. After 2 years of seeing my passion for snakes and reptiles, he was a herpetologist, and being in a rainforest switched the other light on, my passion for the tropics. And then I followed a very unconventional course and a very standard course. The unconventional part of me, at the age of 18, I began spending almost my entire life in a tropical rainforest. Became very active in conservation. It's kind of, rainforests are the front lines of evolution, of science, of taxonomy, of biodiversity, and of the challenges of conserving habitat, because we lose 3,000 acres of rainforest every hour. So that, for me, was a pinnacle moment. That other moment was being featured in a documentary. So I had finished my work as an undergraduate student and was getting into grad school and doing my grad work on bats and snakes in that same rainforest where I first visited when I was 16 years old. So it was now a decade later, and I got featured in a documentary that was doing a project on rainforests. And they wanted this crazy, kooky New England kid catching bats and snakes in the documentary. That other light bulb switched off. So that was the fourth switch. And that was the power of television as a vehicle to do the things I like to do. Engage the public, explore, very quickly distill a story into an episode that checked all the boxes that I wanted people to understand. And it was just a very comfortable medium for me. And it was the time when it happened, which was back in the mid to late 90s, was the beginning of the American generation of TV in nature. Outside of the Blue Ribbon documentary, outside of the David Attenborough worlds or some of the UK stuff, when it began with Steve Irwin and myself, kind of launched that, and that ride continues to this day.
I was going to ask you, how did that conservation work switch over into the TV and documentary world, and you transferred that quite lovely in that statement. What advice would you give to students with an interest in nature and environment?
Well, I get questions like that a lot, and I think people kind of want to time travel forward to hosting a show where they get to go around the world and tell stories. And not that that isn't possible, but it's interesting. When I was very young, I dreamed of traveling around the world and having these incredible adventures. Now that I've been doing that for 20 plus years, I have come to really appreciate the blessings of where I live in New England. I focused more on my connection to the natural heritage of my state. I'm actually developing a film based on New England wildlife because I think it's so overlooked. I overlooked it my whole life. I couldn't wait to get out of Massachusetts and get into a jungle or get into the deserts of Namibia or in the Alaskan tundra. Now I can't wait to come back from the Alaskan tundra and to get in my Carolina skiff and go striped bass fishing or take my kids to look for a wild eastern brook trout stream or go on an adventure with a friend of mine who's studying black bears in the northern woods. I've come to really appreciate my own backyard, which is, I think, the great value of being a naturalist and the great value of nature. We're very lucky in this country. You could live in Madagascar, which has 90% level of endemic species, the highest level really of any place on our planet, and marvels to behold of nature. If you're an animal person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Europlatus geckos and little brookside chameleons, Brookesia chameleons. But 90% of Madagascar is unique, 90% of Madagascar is gone, and 99% of Madagascar citizens do not have access to their natural heritage. 90% of Americans, if they want to, have access to incredible nature, whether it's here in Galveston Bay or whether it's in the Midwest in Tallgrass Prairie or where I live in New England. We are only about, you're never really more than 30 or 40 miles away from a national park, which is quite unique. The entire population of the U.S., we each individually own about a third acre of national park. So it's that backyard thing. You don't appreciate it when it's in your backyard or until it's almost gone.
Thank you for listening to Just Coast Explore Moody Gardens podcast. Join us next time.